Welcome back to Humanities 2. We're going to be looking today at David Hume and British Empiricism in lecture number 4. So this is the middle of 17th century philosophy, mostly British philosophy, but we'll also be looking at some of the other things that influenced British philosophy at this time. Some of the key themes will be empirical epistemology. Hume is an empirical philosopher, as are some of his predecessors. We'll be looking at John Locke, George Berkeley, and anyone else that comes to mind in that field of philosophy. So British empiricism is a philosophical tradition. We'll briefly mention the Scottish Enlightenment and also some of the maturing of the scientific revolutions. So these are some of the key themes that we'll see today. Other figures that may factor in here will also be Francis Bacon, that we've already discussed, but he's part of this British empiricism as well. So we start with John Locke, who inherits from Bacon the epistemological project of empiricism. And so if you haven't noticed, the English typically love empiricism. There aren't many English philosophers and thinkers who aren't empiricists. There are a few minor ones, but for the most part, it's an empirical culture and an empirical tradition. Even going back before Francis Bacon, back into the Renaissance period, look at Occam. Occam himself was English, and Occam's views of the world lend themselves towards empiricism, though we wouldn't consider him today to be an empirical epistemologist, but nominalism lent itself towards that. So then up to Bacon, who's a nominalist, but lays out the project of the scientific induction and getting rid of the idols and so forth that we saw in the last lecture, and now up to John Locke. John Locke, from 1632 up to 1704, is a philosopher who has a lot of things going on. He's one of the top-tier philosophers in the whole history of ideas. Contributions in government and in morality and understanding the relationship of faith and reason. But especially in empirical epistemology is one of the areas that he made some of the greatest contributions. The main work that we're going to look at is the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, written in 1689. A figurehead in British empiricism, a forerunner of George Berkeley and David Hume, J.S. Mill, and other British empiricists. So while British empiricism stretches back to Bacon, Hobbes, and even further to Occam, it is in Locke that empiricism will reach its critical mass, and he is the quintessential empirical philosopher. He epitomizes empiricism at this time, and it's also a time in which Newton is going to be the epitome of modern science, with his Principia Mathematica and his exquisite mathematical principles for explaining the way physical objects behave in the real world. Both are British. This is 18th century British society, and this zeitgeist of science and empirical observation is going to dominate. The British are going to be the first to industrialize, and that industrialized society, that industrial revolution, is going to be built upon the back of science and empirical philosophy. And so it is an application of these deeper disciplines, and it will affect every area of life. So empirical epistemology, knowledge begins with sensation alone and imprints on a tabula rasa of the mind. By slow accumulation, knowledge amasses. That, in a short nutshell, is basically what empirical epistemology teaches, that all knowledge starts with sensation. And some who are radical empiricists will say it starts and ends with sensation, such as Hume. But Locke will admit that we will be able to reflect upon our sensations, but without those sensations, the rasa of the mind, the sheet of the mind, or the blackboard of the mind, if you will, is going to remain completely blank. And so knowledge must start with the senses. Now, Locke and all empiricists reject notions of innate knowledge. and this is a kind of a Cartesian idea. And Locke's essay will be seen as, or he will intend it to be, a correction to Descartes' rationalism. Rationalists think that we have some type of innate built-in knowledge, if nothing else, just in the structure of rationality itself, will guide us to certain areas of knowledge and deep knowledge. Now, rationalists from Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz go all the way back to Plato, and they believe that the rationality of a human being contains innate patterns of thought, innate ideas, and concepts. And so those innate ideas cannot emerge from experience, say the rationalists. The empiricists will differ with them and say, oh yes, they can. Those ideas are not innate. They are gleaned from observing the world and then reflecting on your observations of your experiences. So, Locke insists that any idea must arrive through the senses alone. Ideas in the mind are recorded representations of experience alone. Thus, rationalists and empiricists struggle against each other over the origin of ideas in the mind. Now, one of the people who will change all of this in our next lecture will be Kant, who will come along and take both of these schools of knowledge and take parts of both of them and blend them together in a novel approach to epistemology that will change the whole history of ideas subsequently. Locke's essay reflects deeply on how ideas come to be represented in the mind, but it's a very long, winding path, and it leads to a full refutation of Descartes' rational basis of knowledge. And we can see this, for example, in our reading selection from Locke's essay. He states, quote, "In which and all other cases we may observe that the notion of cause and effect has its rise from ideas received by sensation or reflection, and that this relation, how comprehensive soever, terminates at the last in them." So the idea here he's saying is that even cause and effect is something that you observe with your senses. So the concept of cause and effect emerges from your observations, according to Locke. Thus, for Locke, the critical concept of causality is necessary for a budding modern scientific project as well, but it arises from senses alone. Why is causation going to become a major topic for all of these philosophers? Because science has to discover causes. You're really not doing science until you figure out why something happens. Why does this take place? Why does cancer happen? Why do the planets go around the sun? What causes these things? Now, one of the things that drives our desires to discover causation is that we might somehow learn how to control them, control the natural processes, and manipulate them in some way for our own ends. And that's how we take scientific discoveries. We discover causes, and then we apply that in the world and invent things, whether it's factories, industrial, of the Industrial Revolution, or high technology that we have today, and then we make things happen that according to our own will. And so causation is the critical key here. You have to understand why things happen. But Locke is going to insist that causation is not an innate idea that precedes all experiences and is a necessary idea. It's simply that it is something that emerges from our observations. Now, rationalists will claim that ideas can't come from experience like this. In other words, it's causation that you impose upon things. So it's an idea that you have that precedes your observation of things in this world. So there's a lot of different, tug of war going on here between these rationalists and these empiricists over this issue of causation. And we're going to look at this in Hume as well. But before we get to Hume, we're going to look at George Berkeley, or Bishop Berkeley. He was a bishop who lived from 1685 to 1753. He stands as a link between Locke and Hume. And he fully adopted Lockean views, or is going to work from a Lockean point of view, but he's going to criticize Locke. But he's also going to carry empiricism to one of its logical conclusions. And for most philosophers and students of philosophy, Berkeley's conclusions are somewhat just fantastical. And we'll see why here in just a minute, but it seems as if his conclusions that he takes us to are almost just beyond the pale of imagination. He says in his treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge in 1710 that nothing exists but minds and their ideas. Berkeley is going to insist that the material world is not there. It does not exist. The material world is an illusion, and he is an anti-materialist. Now, Locke was a materialist. Now, about Locke's theology, he was a theist, but sometimes he sounded like a deist, and it's kind of hard to figure out where he stands on that. But often he writes as a deist. For example, one of the books that he writes attempts to show the reasonableness of Christianity, and that Christianity is a reasonable religion, but only because it passes the test of reason in certain areas. But he's a materialist when it comes to what exists. And so human beings are material and so forth. Now, Berkeley is going to attack this materialism and show that, that really the material world doesn't exist at all. Berkeley's principle that he comes up with is esse est percipi, which basically means to be is to be perceived. Ideas are the particulars of mind, the objects of perception. So when I have an idea in my mind, it is when I perceive something. That idea in my mind and the perception, according to Berkeley, are really one. There's no difference between them. And so, it's a very peculiar system. It strikes us as odd that an empiricist would wind up denying that all matter exists. And so it seems that he mixes and combines as inseparable the ideas of the mind with the experience, as I was just saying. It's almost as if he believes in something that I would dub or coin a word for called a thought-sation. Thoughts and sensations are one thing. So for something to be, for me, it must appear to my senses, and it must be an experience. Materiality can't appear to me, okay? So the material reality of something is not something that I can perceive. Material matter itself is not something I can perceive or see, okay? All I can perceive are the properties that things have. And that perception of properties and the idea in my mind are one and the same. So whatever something is, that is its substance, I can't get to that level in my senses. So if I see an apple, I see a red, slightly round object. That sensation is, I'm receiving the particulars of that sensation. Perhaps I'm smelling it, perhaps I'm feeling its weight, and so forth and so on. But its materiality, its substance, whatever it is in itself, is something I can't perceive. And so all that I have are my sensations. So this is kind of a radical empiricism. It is an extreme empiricism, but it leads to a conclusion that sometimes people consider nearly laughable. But it's a serious position that he holds. He says, I experience my own sensations and nothing else, not even really the materiality of the objects. So it seems here that Berkeley's empiricism is leading to kind of a dark dead end where I can know only my sensations and my experiences. But Bishop Berkeley is a good Christian, and he doesn't let his fellow Christians down here into radical skepticism, because he will do something very similar to Descartes. He will invoke God to ensure that all our sensations are legit. So you've probably heard the old question, if a tree falls in a forest and nobody is there to hear it, does it make any sound? Well, Berkeley would say yes, because God is there to hear it. If God was not there to hear the sound, if God was not there to perceive the event, then it would not happen because no one else is there. Okay, to be is to be perceived. But since God perceives all things at all times, then all things persist. So, este es percipe. Now we move to David Hume. Hume's status is going to rank as a top-tier thinker in the history of ideas and perhaps the most important thinker in writing in the English language. He's a naturalist. It's a nicer word for atheist, okay? But he's a full-blown philosophical naturalist. He's a key figure in British empiricism. He's Scottish. He's part of the Scottish Enlightenment that's going on at this time. An explosion of learning in Scottish culture at this time. He's usually considered a skeptic, but like Descartes, he hoped to overcome skepticism. And like Kant, to come in our next lecture, ultimately he did not. Ultimately, knowledge will be probable only. And so what we will wind up with Hume is that all knowledge is simply a probabilistic enterprise. And some are okay with that, that knowledge just winds up with a very good approximation, but there's no certainty, okay? Now, Hume is also famous for waking Kant from his dogmatic slumbers. We'll see that Kant in the next lecture is a rationalist philosopher in the continental rationalist tradition going back to Descartes. And upon reading Hume, he realizes that if Hume's problems are not answered, and if someone doesn't come up with a solution to Hume's problem, then the world will be cast into skepticism. And so Kant takes 10 years to respond, and he writes the Critique of Pure Reason, responding to Hume. But Western culture today remains, until this day, entrenched in some kind of skepticism. Skepticism has almost become the very zeitgeist of our culture now. And so we live in an age of skepticism and insist that we have evidences for what we believe and then hold those evidences always in some type of suspicion. We'll see later on that in the 19th century, atheist philosophers will come forward, such as Nietzsche and Freud and Marx, and all of them will reintroduce us into a skeptical age with the hermeneutics of suspicion. But for now, let's focus back on Hume. Hume built upon the empiricism of Locke and Berkeley, and he takes it to new heights. Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding, 1748, mid-18th century here. He published this 9 years after his treatise on human nature, which he said fell stillborn from the press. In other words, he was publishing at a time in which many, many other great people were publishing things and other things were going on in the culture. And the publication of his great work really didn't get any traction. And so, but it is still a very important work for Western philosophy. The inquiry concerning human understanding is kind of a short revised version of his treatise on human nature. Well, Hume is the empiricist extraordinaire. Hume builds a kind of a naturalistic, scientific, that is Newtonian view of humanity. His inquiry uses skepticism to try to undermine dogmatism, but he seems to want to avoid extreme skepticism at the same time. The question is, does he avoid the skepticism or does he leave us in a skeptical state? Now, concerning this causation issue, this is a matter of great concern for empiricism and science. And this is the one thing that Hume says that will kind of rattle Kant and wake him up from his slumbers. Hume concludes that cause really is only a kind of custom or habit of human thinking. Think about it. When we see event A take place and then event B take place, event A, B, we really just seeing a sequence of events. We don't really know that A causes B. We will associate A and B and think that B was caused by A because the human mind wants to believe that. We want to find the causes of things. But this is just simply something that we want to latch on to. This kind of goes back to one of the idols of the tribe that Bacon was speaking of. The tribe, the human being, wants to discover causes. And so we will latch on to a causal sequence, which is really just a temporal sequence, okay? And so there's no necessary connection there. There's no true cause. It's just a temporal succession. Logicians and critical thinkers will often call this a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy of reasoning. The after this, therefore because of this fallacy. And let's see if I can explain it to you in a very simple way. You probably remember hearing a story about a rooster that could make the sun come up. And several of the hens in the chicken yard did not believe the rooster. And so they asked him to show them. And so one morning, before the sun had come up early, when it was still dark, he asked them, invited them to come out. So he starts crowing, and indeed the sun came up. And they were not sure about that, so he did it again the next day. And so they were convinced that indeed, when he crowed, that was what made the sun come up. And so they fell for a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. And though this is an example that even a child can understand, human beings fall for these kind of problems or these type of fallacies all the time. And Hume will say that our scientific quest to understand causation latches onto a causation that isn't really a causal connection at all. It's just a temporal connection. Why? Because we so desperately want to understand cause so we can manipulate it and use it for our ends. Now let's take a look at Humean skepticism. Hume's skepticism rises from his intentional use of ancient skepticism, Pyrrhonianism, to undermine dogmatic claims of metaphysics. But he also simultaneously is going to use a lot of Stoic thought as well in his thinking. His assault at the end of our reading section focuses on metaphysics. And this is a famous passage from Hume. He says, "When we run over libraries persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity and number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion." And so we see here in this quote that Hume is trying to attack scholasticism, metaphysics, the whole idea that there might be any type of transcendence or transcendent realm, universals, and so forth. And so he doesn't think any of that is useful at all in the project of modern science and in the project of building knowledge. And so he wants to cast any of that into the flames. But aside from his full frontal assault, there are other factors leading to skepticism in Hume's thought. Hume's empirical epistemological project tries to undermine objective knowledge. His rigorous empiricism leads us deep into a labyrinth and then turns out the lights. Let's look at some of the steps that are going to take place if we follow Hume's thinking here. First of all, pure empiricism that he follows means that I can only rely upon my sensations that I have to gain knowledge. So I can't rely upon your sensations. I can't rely upon anyone else's. I have to basically rely upon my own sensations. No knowledge of the substance of things is possible. And so substance can't be perceived. I do not know what things are in and of themselves. This is going to be forever lost and locked away, if you will. I only receive the sensations that I have. This is a kind of a purely subjective world of knowing that emerges at this point. No objective knowledge is possible, not even of the causes of seemingly connected events. No mental substance exists either, no soul. My individual selfhood is going to start to lose ground. No Cartesian cogito is going to provide the kernel for my existence. Nothing like that's available for Hume's system. Whatever I am, whoever I am, rests upon an aggregate bundle of shifting perceptions, a constant stream of unconnected sensations. Without a coherent self, the only thing my consciousness can do is go around this whole process again, go around deeper, relying on sensations that never reveal any objective knowledge. And so even the idea of consciousness that's propelling me on is going to come into doubt. And around I go, deeper and deeper into skepticism with no exits, except to accept that we're creatures of habit and custom. What we call knowledge is nothing more than our own desire for creature comforts, if you will. Things that the creature desires, the human creature, the human tribe desires in order to make sense of its world. And so custom and habit, those are the only things that I have to help me escape this kind of cycling down, spiral down into skepticism that Hume laid out. Now, Immanuel Kant will pick up this challenging mess left by the rationalist and by the empiricist projects of epistemology. And we will see in our next lecture that Kant, awakened by Hume's empirical meltdown into skepticism, will set forth an ambitious project to blend and correct both of these schools of epistemology. So what are some of the conclusions that we can draw by looking at Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and then looking forward to Kant? Well, knowledge is greatly conditioned by our human nature, like Bacon said in The Idols of the Tribe. Customs and passions deeply affect our endeavor to know. Science wants to discover causes of natural events. Why? So that we can then manipulate nature for our own purposes. So it's a very human-driven project to know this world and to figure out causes. It's almost as if Hume affirmed the idol of the tribe that Bacon had identified 130 years earlier. Empirical epistemology had run its course through many philosophers and wound up in skepticism.